Okay, next one, number 40. This one is an interesting question. F of x equals x cubed minus 7x squared plus 25x minus 39. And g is the inverse function of f. So g of x equals the inverse of f. And they want to know what is g prime of 0. So this question, you're really out of luck unless you remember this, which is the derivative of the inverse function is equal to 1 over the derivative of the function of the inverse, okay? So, if you don't remember this, it's just about impossible to do this question. I mean, you just have to skip it. But if you do remember it, then you're okay. So, the derivative of the inverse, I'm going to rewrite this now. The derivative of the inverse equals 1 over the derivative of my function evaluated for at the inverse of x, okay? So the derivative of the inverse, well, that's just, my inverse is g of x, so it's just g prime of x equals 1 over f prime of g of x, okay? All right, so they want to know g prime of 0. Well, g prime of 0 equals 1 over f prime of g of 0. And you say, okay, I just got to find g of 0. Well, in order to find g of 0, we have to understand what an inverse is. Well, an inverse means I'm swapping my x with my y. So g of 0 means rather than plugging 0 into x and finding what my function is, I have to find g of 0, well, g of 0 is equal to the 0 of my function, f of x. Okay, instead of where x would equal 0, it would be, if this was y, it would be where y is equal to 0. So for my inverse, instead of x being equal to 0, my y is equal to 0. That's how an inverse works if I'm talking about g of 0. Okay, so I have to find the 0 of this function. Now, to do this with calculus, I mean, it's all calculus, but to do it by hand is not the easiest thing in the world. You kind of have to do quadratic equation, but we don't have to do that because we have our calculators. So all we have to do is just find the 0 of this function. G of 0 will be the 0 of this function, so we just plot this function in our calculator and find the 0. And we end up finding that g of 0, or the 0 of this function, is equal to 3. Okay, so we now have g of 0, so I can say 1 over f prime of 3. Well, I'm not quite out of the woods yet, because clearly I need to find f prime of x. Well, f prime of x is fairly straightforward. It's just 3x squared minus 14x plus 25. F prime of 3 then is equal to 3 times 3 squared minus 14 times 3 plus 25. 3 squared is 9 times 3 is 27. Minus 3 times 14 is 42. Plus 25. This equals 25 plus 27 is 52, minus 42 is 10, and this whole thing ends up being 1 over 10. Okay, cool. So the answer ends up being C. That's my final answer, is C for this one. It's definitely one of the trickier ones because you have to know this one, and that equation is hard enough to remember as it is, let alone work with it. But I don't want to discourage you. You definitely all can do it. You just got to remember that little function. It might even be easier to remember as this: g prime of x equals 1 over f prime of g of x, if g is my inverse, rather than thinking inverse. All that stuff gets confusing, right? So just remember g prime of x equals 1 over f prime of g of x when g of x is my inverse function. And then we have to remember that g of 0 is not plugging in 0 to f of x. It's actually setting this whole thing equal to 0 and solving for x, which is equivalent to finding the 0 of the function on your calculator. Once I have that, then I take my derivative, figure that out at g of 0, which turns out to be 3. And that step is pretty easy, or simple rather. So you can do it. You can totally do this one. It's tougher, but you can do it. So like I said, you can skip it, but don't skip it. Just bubble it in with something if you can't figure it out. But I think you can do it. So just do your best to remember that function. You'll be all right. All right. Hope you understood this. I'll see you in the next video.